So since we are on time, maybe we can start and then people will continue joining in. We have people from Japan, from Russia.
Edgardo, can you remind us who is the audience for this
Yes,
webinar? Yeah.
yes, we have people. We have ISA school members,
Oh, I remember
and
now.
we
Yes.
and we
Yes.
have also scholars, people that are retired, teachers that want to learn more about how to be how to work with international education and what tools can they get in order to uh, have this international education for peace and how they can work with different activities and workshops so the kids can understand the
Good.
similarities and
Anyone,
differences that
anyone,
we have.
anyone from Russia and Ukraine listening in?
Yes, we have Pablo Flores, that is he's the director of the international department, and he's in Moscow. He's a school that just joined ISA in the past months. They participate on our youth leadership encounter about climate justice. So we met each other in Milan, and he's in Russia now in Moscow.
Great. Thank you.
So if you agree, we can start. So thank you very much for being in this amazing webinar that we have today. We have three amazing speakers. Uh, ISA, since it was created, we were discussing that with Betty, always thought about education and international education in terms of creating a curriculum framework for education for peace and how we can achieve this by celebrating our differences, our similarities, accepting that we are different, that we have different cultures, different religions, in order not to confront like what is happening nowadays in Europe and the wars that we have since the beginning of time. So the idea is that we have within this with these three amazing speakers some clarity and how we can have different tools and how we can work in order to give our students different strategies in order to have a better world and have a peaceful world. So the idea today, we have Betty, that she's 93, and we have Tony. So we are going to have some videos that they recorded since Betty felt more comfortable with that idea. So so that's why we are going to have some excerpts of 8-minute videos. They are, of course, here presently to answer questions at the end. And we have Fernando that is here also, that he will speak lively. So that's a little bit of the idea of the webinar. We will have some questions and some short videos, and also Fernando will join in the questions. And then at the end, we can have interaction between the three speakers and with the audience. And you can write the questions on the chat. I will read them and I will post them to the speakers. So without further ado, I will present Tony Jenkins. He has a PhD. He's the managing director of an international institute on peace education. He is a lecturer of justice and peace studies in Georgetown University, and he's a coordinator of the Global Campaign for Peace Education. He is founder and co-managing editor of Peace Knowledge Press. And the first two questions that I will ask Tony is, what is the current status of the field of peace and international education? And how do we work with and prepare educators also for being able to maintain their holistic view in their pedagogical practice? So now I'm going to share with you. Jorge, you need to let me share. 1 second. It needs to allow me to share. I have the video here. Sorry about that. We put it in before, but now it's not working for the moment. He will in a minute. Let me share the
You can always count on technical problems.
Yeah.
You should be able to share, Edgardo, can't you?
No, not now.
Because everybody can present.
Maybe I will enter again. I don't know what happened. It says only the organizers and moderators of the meeting can share. Okay, I will enter again and maybe.
It shows you as a
Give me a minute.
Yeah.
Okay. If you put me as an organizer, maybe that's a co-organizer. Sorry about that. Ah, there it is.
There it was.
But I can get the ball rolling by sharing sort of what I see as the current status.
There's no volume.
Well, nothing can be heard.
Right.
Yes, I know. You're working on it.
Are you listening quite well or not?
No, we are not listening. We are not listening.
Well,
But I can get the ball rolling by sharing sort of what I see as the current status of the field. And this is all kind of based on the the multiple hats that I find myself wearing. One is obviously as academic, as someone who's trying to participate with colleagues around the world and articulating what the field is. And the second hat I wear is more related to the advocacy work that we do through the Global Campaign for Peace Education, and also, of course, the work we do collaboratively in advancing the field through the International Institute on Peace Education, two projects of which Betty initiated. So thinking academically, these are just obviously my own piecemeal reflections. This is certainly not some specifically broad, well-researched overview of the field. But a couple of things that I've been observing. I actually feel like the state of scholarship is quite strong right now. I think there is a really good generation of older scholars and emerging scholars who are doing a lot of really good critical scholarship in the field. One of the things that in particular I see emerging that I think is really important is a really strong sense of holism, which is one of the things that you've worked on for most of your career, trying to articulate these notions of comprehensive peace education. And this holism, well, I guess what I see with this holism is an understanding of the strong interdependence between the personal and the political, and how we pursue personal change and this relationship to political change. And I'm also seeing, at least within the scholarship, some really emerging strong views on the relationship between social change and structural change, which is obviously two important dimensions of the puzzle that we work on through peace education. I would say I want to offer kind of a critique of that too. While I'm seeing on this really wonderful scholarship emerging, I have some concerns. One has been there's a kind of a frame that has been really strong, particularly over the last 8 to 10 years, in bringing in a decolonial framework into peace education. And obviously that's really strongly warranted. It provides this very important and critical critique of system structures and power analysis. And I think where my critique is, it's a gentle critique. It's a concern that through this emergent scholarship and this particular lens that we've become a little bit out of balance. And so I think there has been a tendency to kind of it's I would say it's a more tacit and a subconscious sort of tendency in a way, because we've directed our focus to these kind of decolonial frameworks to reject any form of knowledge or approach to learning or education that might be traditional or come from a certain point of view. So I see some people kind of really summarily rejecting the ideas that you could learn through some kind of lecture and response format, for example. That is being is considered a colonial practice, and so therefore it must be bad. And I think we need to be careful about that. I mean, I don't agree that that's true. I think we've been out of balance for a long time, so I understand the tendency to make that kind of pull and that overcorrection. But I'm concerned because we can, in practice, create this bifurcation. We can create these binaries, which are, I think, deeply harmful. And so that brings me back to this holism and the challenge of that and how we pursue it. And so some critical questions that come up for me with that are related to the challenges of educators in bringing, at least into their practice, their pedagogical practice, a deep awareness of the different kinds of approaches that we might need to take in learning that to foster and nurture personal change, as well as prepare students to engage in structural change. And that can be really kind of overwhelming, trying to hold a holistic container like that, because it's a lot to kind of keep in your mind at all times. And I think as I think about that, it brings up a challenge that maybe I'll address more in looking at the second question. But how do we work with and prepare educators for being able to maintain that holistic view in their pedagogical practice? And I think it comes down to, for the most part, I mean, there's no formal way to do it, but I think for the most part, it's going to be rooted in creating this sort of reflective praxis, which is so important to being transformative educators. All right, so that's kind of the thoughts I had on the academic side, and then really quickly on the advocacy side, in terms of political support for peace education. I actually feel a really good sense right now in the moment that we're at, and two kind of recent experiences come to mind. One is, Betty, I was involved last year in consulting with UNESCO to support them in the revision of the 1974 recommendation concerning education for international understanding, cooperation, and peace, and education relating to human rights and fundamental freedoms. And the revision of this this important normative framework, I think is really significant. There's a reflection that education has obviously significantly changed over the last 50 years since that was developed. And the conversation has been one that has been really embracing of the holism that I just talked about, and in the ways in which, at least now that I have a copy of the very first draft of the revision in my hands, I think it is representing the evolutions of the field that we've seen in really important ways. I mean, there are still gaps that need to be addressed, but I think it's a strong start. And then the second reflection I wanted to share was related to a recent experience I had in Colombia, where the Ministry of Education and the National Ministry of Education has been responding to obviously 50 years of internal violent conflict. One of the things that came out more recently is the Truth Commission report, which was published this past summer. And in that report, they articulate the critical importance of education in contributing to the future possibilities of peace emerging in the country. And I think what we're seeing there is groundbreaking in the sense that these official documents, these official frameworks, are calling for holism in how the challenge of building a culture of peace in the country needs to be pursued. So it specifically identifies the personal dimensions of the conflict. It specifically identifies the structural impediments that need to be addressed for being able to move forward. It specifically identifies, obviously, the social dimensions of the conflict and being able to heal wounds and rebuild relationships, but it also tackles the necessity of cultural change and addressing cultures of militarism. And I think I haven't seen something like this issued at that level within formal education before. And so there's this deep understanding of the interdependencies between these various dimensions of the kind of the peace puzzle that I think is really encouraging in the discussions and debates that are happening there, and the future needs of peace education have been really encouraging. So let me stop.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. I think that was very interesting. Sorry again about the sorry again about the problems with the computer, but I think that that's very interesting, and I think what you're saying is it's very true. It's complicated to give these skills to students in order to be global citizenships, and how we give them these values of liberty, of responsibility in their actions. And the case of Colombia is a complicated case, first inside the country and then in the region, right? How should we build on that? So I would like to introduce now Fernando, moving forward, in order to give him an opportunity to answer these two questions. So Fernando, thank you for being here. He is the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice in International Education. He's the Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative and of the International Education Policy Program at Harvard University Graduate School of Education. So thank you, Fernando. And the questions are the same: is what is the current status of the field of peace and international education, and how do we work with and prepare educators for being able to maintain their holistic view in their pedagogical practice?
Thank you, Edgardo. Let me start sharing that a few weeks ago, I was in Berlin. I was there for a conference, and I spent some time visiting a number of the museums that memorialize the very dark chapter in the history of Berlin with the breakdown of German democracy and the rise of Hitler to power. And at the end of that visit, I thought, if there is one city where we will never see that kind of violence again, it would be Berlin. And so on my very last Sunday, I went to the gate of Brandenburg, and I was trying to walk from there to Humboldt University, and basically was stopped by a demonstration of more than 5,000 people who, under the banner of Germany First, were demanding the German government to stop supporting the government of Ukraine because it had increased the prices of gasoline. And I thought, what an irony that Mr. Putin has given ammunition to the fascists in Germany. And so soon after that, I had a chance to watch this document by Ken Burns, which I recommend to all of you, The U.S. and the Holocaust, which is an extremely thoughtful three-part series that talks about the role the United States play, including a number of people who were peace activists who thought the U.S. should not become involved in a war, in a way becoming complicit in the murder of 6 million Jews and many other people. So I bring those two examples only to highlight that peace is complicated business. that peace is complicated business in a world in which states use violence against their citizens and against the citizens of other nations. And what that leads me to say is that this is a time when there's a great need to democratize the field of peace education. And I'm going to explain why and then talk about the opportunities to do that. Let me for a moment digress and talk about the field of climate change education and the science of climate change. I think we will all agree that there is a huge disconnect between the state of scholarship on climate change and the way most people behave and the way governments behave. And I've spent some time thinking about that disconnect, and I think in part it is caused because the people who study climate change spend most of their time talking to themselves. They publish in journals that they read, but they don't really spend much time talking to teachers, to educators. And the result of that is that when you look, as I have, at the evaluations of the effectiveness of climate change education programs, most of them are not only ineffective, they're actually counterproductive. They teach the students that this topic is so complicated that there is nothing they can do about it. So let me come back to peace education. I do think that if we are to address the challenges of growing violence, beginning in the United States, for example, where we have in all records high reports on anti-Semitism in America, including in our universities. I served for 7 years on the Massachusetts State Board of Higher Education. In our 19 public universities, we have neo-Nazi groups recruiting people under banners that are openly fascist. And this is Massachusetts. This is not the south of the US. It is not the Midwest of the United States. So I think if we are going to address these challenges, it is very important to connect with teachers and with ordinary people. And I think that the opportunities to do that, I'm going to talk about 3 opportunities to do that. As some of you, I suppose, know, UNESCO, which in its history has 3 times published a report on the futures of education, published about a year ago, a report called Transforming Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. And the essence of that report is that the change in the culture of education is going to happen when students and teachers, parents, literally everybody, looks at the state of the world we're in and asks, what does that mean in terms of the competencies we need our students to develop? And how do we begin to do that change Monday morning in our schools? The report is, in fact, an invitation to a broad-based global social movement to transform education. And there are good things happening. And if you read that document, the first 2 chapters of that document talk about the state of the world. And they talk about growing violence within states and between states, the challenges to human rights, the challenges, democratic backsliding, and climate change. So I think that report is an opportunity for everyone interested in peace education to engage in more democratic practices that actually speak to students and to teachers, to practitioners and to policymakers, that use this report as a window of opportunity to democratize the practice of this field. I think another related opportunity was a summit that just took place at the UN, organized by the Secretary General. The Secretary General can, obviously, with the UN, choose any topic for a World Summit that they want. And I think it's telling that in September, they convene world leaders to talk about education. And if you look at the communique of the Secretary General, his vision for the summit, it's all articulated around SDG number 4, which, if you read it, is really about educating global citizens. It's about educating people who understand and are committed to human rights and to a world in which those rights are a reality, which in my view is, as those who drafted those rights agreed, the way to make sure that we have the conditions for sustainable peace, to build a world in which those rights are a reality for everyone, in which we not only recognize those rights for everyone, but we actively engage in building a world in which that is a reality. And I've talked to people very involved in the UN who tell me if we had to vote today on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, maybe we would have support for half of those rights, not for the 30 rights that are in the declaration. So that speaks to the state of the world. So to go back to your question, the work that I have done, as I think some of you know, is on how to align education with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think what that requires are two things: a clear curriculum in which groups of teachers take the time to study what these goals are and then translate those goals into what are the capacities that people need to make that world a reality. And then turn that into a series of experiences for students to help them gradually build that capacity. And I think there is one way in which we don't do that, which is with one-shot activities. I don't think anyone develops the capacities to become a steward for human rights because they watch one documentary or they attend one lecture, but because their entire educational experience, little by little, gives them an experience of what it's like to be in communities where those rights are a shared concern and are a North Star for the work of the school, where the school, in effect, becomes an institution that anticipates a future that is better than the world that students experience outside of schools. And of course, because curricula is not self-executing, the next order of business is to make sure that teachers develop the capacities to create those experiences for students. And that too is entirely doable. And I think there is nothing more powerful than actually showing what does it look like. I think that, just to give an example and to put some meat into these ideas, in the United States, there is a phenomenal resource sponsored by the George Lucas Foundation, the filmmaker. It's called Edutopia. Those of you who haven't seen it, I encourage you to look at it. Edutopia is a website that basically shows teachers what are the kinds of activities that teachers could lead for their students that would develop a range of pro-social skills: the capacity to see the world through the eyes of another, the capacity to negotiate differences, the capacity to work collaboratively with other people. So those are my initial thoughts. If I had to summarize them, I would say it's very important for the conversation of peace education to connect with very large numbers of teachers. I mean large numbers, like 1.2 billion. That's the number of teachers in the world. And it is essential. And I think that these recent efforts of the UN and UNESCO provide a real opening to do that. That is what the current conversation is about. So I think we are at a good time, but we're also at a very dangerous time. As my reference to the group of neo-fascists parading the streets of Berlin illustrates, as my reference to the growing violence in the United States of America and other countries point to. Thank you, Edgardo.
Thank you, Fernando. And I agree with you. It's not only a drop in the ocean, but continue working with different activities all the time, work every year or have themes every year. But these topics should be always on the table of the students: education for peace and education for sustainability. I agree with you 100%. And if we do not reach to this 1.2 billion teachers, that would be very complicated for students to get the information. So I agree that we are in a good time, but in a dangerous time also. So thank you, Fernando. And now I would like to introduce Betty Reardon. She's 93. So thank you, Betty, for being with us here. Betty is the founding director of the Peace Education Center and Peace Education Graduate Degree Program at Teachers College in Columbia University. She's the leader in peace education. She's a leader in peace education and a scholar in human rights education. So thank you, Betty. And the two questions are posed to you too. So we're going to show now the video of Betty.
Is take off from your remarks and fill in some things that I either disagree with or that you haven't pointed to. I look at this from two perspectives, and I think most people who know my work know that I do. That I am fundamentally a classroom teacher, and that is the way I approach the general problematic of planned learning for peace education. as what is it that we actually do in the classroom that enables learners to engage in the kind of thinking that can address the problematic. And that problematic is the generalized problematic of systematic and direct violence that exists throughout the system, from the lowest level, even in our schools, as we know, to the international global level. The other perspective I bring is that I went directly from the classroom to work in a research institute, the Institute for World Order, which was a peace research institute. I thereby became very active in the International Peace Research Association and in the development of curriculum for world order studies. And so the problematics of the practical, pedagogical were, to me, integral to the problematic of the systematic violence, namely the war system, that was the central concern of the Institute for World Order. So the other thing that I wanted to note in terms of your remarks, particularly your remarks about UNESCO, was that early on I understood that when we worked in the international arena, we were working basically in challenging the system that we were involved in. And what many of the researchers came up with in order to name that arena in which we were working was transnationalism, the transnational level, which is distinct from international. And it is the citizen of whatever nation acting as a global citizen, transnationally, above and outside of the international system. So that's one of my issues about UNESCO is an international organization. It has an international perspective, which I respect very much. I worked many years very closely with UNESCO and at UNESCO. And there were a number of us there who were transnational thinkers. And we worked within that international structure toward trying to conceptualize what would be practical global citizenship. The term global citizenship, like the term culture is bandied about, and it is very conceptually muddy. In the best I can come up with, in terms of what is possibly global citizenship, a capacity and a responsibility toward which peace educators should be developing pedagogy is being active in international civil society organizations that are linked to similar organizations transnationally and which make up a body of global citizens. The attempts of these organizations and individuals to influence policy, their attempts to expand thinking, if you will, to educate the internet, those who control and run the system, about the true global realities as they are lived on the local level. Because all of these activists work on the local level. Some of them have shifted their priorities to the global for a while, but they come from the roots of the people. They first discern the problematic, the various forms of violence that interrupt their lives at the local level, even at the family level. You know that my other perspective, which I will not expose now, but I will mention, is patriarchy. So even at the family level, that violence is significant. And we know that those actions are affecting the international system. Most of the human rights standards we have come from this kind of activity. The Women, Peace and Security Resolution 1325 comes from civil society. So I think that there is also the other element of what you were talking about in terms of we can't wrap our heads around holism. It's very hard. I think it's because we don't think holistically. We're putting it all together piece by piece. And I too will get to that at the second the second question. But I also, in terms of what I've just said and that past observation, is that I want to emphasize the local. And I have on many occasions turned the think locally, act globally, staying on its head, to plead with those who are supposedly the global actors to think locally when they make decisions about policies at the global level, at the international, what is practically the international level. How is that going to impact on human persons on the ground?
Yeah.
And that is the final question. How does it impact on human persons in the way they live their daily lives? And will this in any way contribute to the reduction of violence? And so my summary there would be, we need to think not only in holistic global terms, we have to think more closely, specifically, and in a detailed manner in humanistic terms, the effects on human life. Okay.
Thank you, Betty, very much. I agree with you about the holistic approach and to think more about in humanism, in a humanism way, and also about that violence starts at home and then everything is moving forward with violence. So I believe that it's important to think locally, locally and globally, but start from something very little as our family and our violence within our family that we have, and then moving forward to our community, to our school, to our country, to our continent, to our region, and then globally, and thinking transnational, not international. That is also a concept that is very important for us to think about, and how we can share that and transmit that. I think Fernando just left us for a minute, but our next question that I wanted to pose to him was what do we see as the future direction of the field, and what other needs we perceive, and how do we achieve them in terms of international education for peace, in terms of how do we, for example, promote and give our students the skills of being an active global citizens? How do we transmit to them the principles and the relationship to human welfare, such as justice, liberty, responsibility, equality, dignity, security, democracy, and solidarity? So how do we do that in order to move forward? I don't know, Fernando, if you hear the question, or I ask it again.
I would be grateful if you can ask it again. I apologize. Yeah.
No, don't worry. No, the question is, after the great dissertation of Betty, is what do we see as the future direction of the field, and what are the needs we perceive, and how do we achieve them? And I was thinking about how do we give our students the as members of the global society, how do we give them the principles relating to human welfare, like justice, liberty, responsibility, equality, dignity, security, democracy, and solidarity? As you were saying, how do we act more democratic each time, and how do we give these students those skills in order to be active global citizens and not only uh, passive global citizens, right?
Oh, I think Betty said it very well. She said she began her work as a teacher. And I think it's very important to keep that perspective. When I say that we need to democratize the field, that's what I mean. It's really important to support and to produce resources that at the end of the day mean something to the teachers, but that also means understanding the context in which teachers work. For example, in the United States, most states have standards which govern what public schools must do. For high poverty schools and schools that have, let's say, average or below average levels of performance, teachers are under tremendous pressure to align their instruction with those standards. That means if I want them to engage their students in peace education, I can't come with a curriculum and the expectation they're going to superimpose a curriculum to what they have to do. I have to figure out a way to insert opportunities for peace education in the work that teachers have to do and which they are held accountable for. That's what I mean by adopting a teacher-centric perspective in advancing that. But I also think it's very, very important that we have ambitions to solve this problem at the right scale. I think I've worked for over a decade in the field of global citizenship education, which I see as not synonymous, but related to the field of peace education. And I think in this field, there is a real danger to talk only to the people who understand what you're doing and who value it. And let's stay with the United States, an increasingly divided country and polarized nation in which it's very difficult to do this work in some communities. Of course, the path of least resistance is to do this work in the communities that most appreciate it. But this doesn't solve the problem. This further divides this nation. I think we need to figure out a way to do this work in communities where the parents aren't quite ready to embrace it and where the teachers may, or part of their needs may be the needs for safety, for knowing that they are not going to be at danger, professional or personally, from engaging in this kind of work. To be very blunt, I have a very good friend who does a lot of work nationally. And some years ago, running a workshop about that, he said, Fernando, why don't you just stop talking about global citizenship education? Because I'm concerned that there are parts in this country where you could be shot for using those words. And so, to me, I think we need to situate this conversation in context, in the context that teachers work in, and in the local and national context in which they operate. But my sense is that the imperative for all of us is to get outside our comfort zones and say, how do we do this work where it is most needed? And to me, that's certainly not LA or New York, highly cosmopolitan places that are ready, or Seattle, that are ready to embrace that work. It means doing these works in Arkansas and in parts of this nation that haven't had the opportunity to understand how peace education connects to their local problems.
Thank you, Fernando. I think you were very clear, and the question and also the challenges to work in places where we do not have these cosmopolitan ideas, or these words are not used all the time, and they are not familiar with the concept. And there is where we have much more work to do as educators. So I will pose the same question to Tony and Betty for a conversation. what do we see as the future direction of the field, and what are the needs that we perceive, and how do we achieve them? So I'm going to share now the video.
A weird turn here, and I think I'll talk about an idea that came up in a conversation that we had several months ago when we held your book club on the reissue of Comprehensive Peace Education, and we were talking about a challenge that we perceived and or maybe some failures of the movement over the past 50 years. And one of those was connected to this idea that articulate with clarity the effects of the war system. And I think there are some assumptions that we have that if people simply just knew those things, that they would give up those ways of being and so forth and so on. And so I find that in my own practice and working with young people right now that we don't have a problem articulating those deficiencies and those problems. I think students conceptually get it. But I think they're in a place where they're kind of dealing with existential anxiety. And I think this is something that plays out in many different kind of levels. I mean, there's the existential anxiety that is just brought on by the various global threats that we're now experiencing, the increased proliferation of nuclear weapons, climate change, militarism, and so forth, pandemics, and so forth and so on. So there's that kind of tangible layer of it. But there's kind of a deeper layer. I mean, these things are, in particular, the endurance of militarism is deeply rooted in cultures and in structures. It's deeply tied to systems of global commerce and capitalism and so forth and so on. And these various isms are the kind of foundations of the world in which these students live. And to truly change, to really kind of develop that authentic human agency that brings our attention to challenges of structures, institutions, to human lives, and that means we have to give up all these assumptions about the way the world is, who we are, how we got where we are in this moment. And that's really hard for people to let go. So I think kind of got down to this existential anxiety question is something I want to bring more attention to, because if we can't overcome that, I see that as a fundamental block to the human agency that we need to get to in order to kind of create the systemic cultural changes that we're facing with. So I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, on how I'm expressing, but I feel like it's a challenge that requires us to think about how we need to bring more attention to hope, how we need to structure to design our learning, more opportunities that help us to see the change possible. The various aspects of all the great work that you've done in terms of engaging students in practices of modeling, designing, and envisioning alternative futures, and the importance of developing that, not just in terms of the thinking that's necessary for that, but also developing the skills to be able to participate in the processes constructively, amongst other things. So maybe I'll stop there and turn it to you and to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I interested that you are picking up this existential anxiety. When I think of the future of the field, I have to think of a recent feature film that I would highly recommend everybody see. I think it was actually about climate crises, multiple, and the accumulation thereof to climate disaster. But it also could be applied, and it was applied as I watched it and thought about, to nuclear weapons. And the film is called Don't Look Up. And it is essentially about systematic denial. And we have been in systematic denial. I mean, even peace education has been in systematic denial. And if you say it isn't, I'll argue with you. Because we're going on with business as usual too, Tony. And I think we have to admit it, that we are in these existential crises, that nothing we do that doesn't take them into consideration can hope to be effective in and of itself and its own purposes, much less addressing the crises. And, in terms of what I was talking about in the actual quality of human life, even if we come to the point of human intellectual capacity where we don't have resolution, the time before the disaster that has to be lived. So we have to think about what is the quality of that time, as well as striving with all our professional and personal and political might to hold back these disasters, particularly climate crisis and nuclear weapons. But there's a third one that determines what's going to happen with climate crisis and nuclear weapons that we have not addressed, and that is the global rise of authoritarianism. Now, in Brazil, the recent election gave us some hope that what was left of the Amazon, the lungs of the planet, might be resuscitated. That is some hope. But unless and until we as educators help our students to understand what authoritarianism is, what the indicators are, what the process of development is, what the possibilities for interrupting that process are, and then the capacities to make decisions about whether they will act to interrupt, that they will, but not be making that distinction between our own activists and our responsibilities as educators. They must make these decisions. We can only give them the tools, and the tools are the way in which we form the inquiry, the way in which we pose the problem, also calling forth from them their own definitions of the problem. They might see it differently, and it might be helpful to us as to see how they see it. I'm sure when you're talking about the international, the existential, to me that is saying, the existential anxiety of your student, you're acknowledging that you have the as a teacher, some of these perspectives. Those are invaluable tools. Those tools use as pedagogues, as teachers.
Yeah.
So it is the authoritarianism which has been on the rise, which has promoted and nurtured denial of the other two crises and continued business as usual in exploitation and in a notion of security, which is my nation, my people are secured if we have the ability to destroy your people.
Yeah.
So That is destructive thinking. We need to move not only to a pedagogy of hope, but we need to move to a pedagogy of possibility. We have to spend many of our hours of learning with our in exploring possibilities. You know, knowing me, you know that I hate brainstorming. I think it is the most unsystematic, unproductive thing. But I think there is a way of what I call harvesting of ideas. And the ideas come in large part from seeds we plant in the discourse of our classrooms. But we should, every once in a while, assess what is that comes from that seed planting and see if we can harvest ideas for possibilities. And if we do that and do it in such a way as the students see their ideas being considered, that in itself, I think, is hope giving to them, because they see that it's will attend to their ideas. And if other people attend to their ideas in this setting, it could happen in others. And that then opens possibilities and abilities and the recognition of possibilities in which hope lies. And, I always make the distinction between hope and optimism. Optimism is just, it's all going to be okay in the end. Well, maybe it won't. But if it will be because there are possibilities. And when we recognize the possibilities, then we can be hopeful. And I would like to think that we could, as educators, develop a pedagogy that is practical, that is distributable to others and others into that process. Because I think we need to expand the process. And there's other things that I would say, but I'm sure we're going to have to cut a lot of this out anyway. But the last thing I wanted to say is that even the film Don't Look Up, and those of us who are involved in this discussion, we all sit at one side of the planet, or we're all geographically compromised. We're all in the global north. And where the consequences of these existential crises now and in the future are the most significant are in the global south. Our responsibility as global citizens, as well as peace educators, is to open the discourse to the global south. And I would hope that all of the participants in the International Institute on Peace Education and those the Global Campaign for Peace Education will think of ways to do that, and that those who are in the global south and those networks would actively connect their perspectives and their ideas, because we need them, as we need our students. All of us in the north need the ideas of the people of the south, and men need the ideas of. And that is the end of my thesis.
Thank you, Betty. A lot of things to reflect, right? The movie Don't Look Up. It's really, from your point of view and how you marked it. It's really true. Sometimes we just continue with our lives and see in television conflicts or things that are happening in the other side of the world, or in the global south. or in the global north, and we see, well, as at least, or not at least, but if it's not me or my relatives or people who I am, who are my family, then it's a problem of the other, you know. You see it on TV, and unless it affects to you, that violence or the war or the conflict, you do not sometimes act. So we are very sometimes reactive to that in terms of being proactive. So we are getting at the end of our webinar, and the idea is, if some of you three want to reflect about what we talked about, some more comments or remarks or additions to what we spoke today, and I will look forward to your questions in the chat in order to have some interaction with the audience. But if Tony or Betty or Fernando want to add something or comment, yes, Fernando, go ahead.
Yeah,
I will look for the question.
I like that Fernando raised his hand.
No, but
and
after you,
digitally
yeah.
and that's how I want to pose my questions.
No, after you, Betty, you wanted to say something.
No, I just was commenting on the fact that you raised your hand. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Betty. I just want to say how pleased I am that the International Schools Association is promoting this conversation within the association. The question of how do you become more intentional to actually be more effective? Because I do think the world has seen extraordinary progress in education since 1948, when the right of education was included in the Declaration in terms of expansion of the opportunity to be schooled. And if you look at all the wonderful things that happened to advance, in a way, cosmopolitanism, including the creation of your association, including the IBE and so on, they speak about a time when people understood the need to educate people for peace. But because the world keeps changing, sometimes a little faster than we do in education institutions, it is completely appropriate that we look in the mirror and we ask ourselves, are we doing everything we each could at this moment? And I think that the IB should be asking that question. I think every public school should be asking that question. Every university should be asking that question, especially as we celebrate International Education Week this week, in which we celebrate the value of international education and exchange. I just wanted to mention that in 1928, just to talk about whether things have changed, how much has changed, and how little has changed, a professor at Teachers College, a Romanian immigrant by the name of Isaac Kandel, who was one of the founding figures of the field of global education in the world, gave a talk to the Association of Secondary School Superintendents in Association of Secondary School Principals. And in that talk, if you read his speech, the speech is divided in 3 sections of approximately equal length. The first section says that every high school student in America should be educated to understand American interdependence with the rest of the world. The second section of the paper goes on to explain that he's not a communist, that he shouldn't want people to be confused. This is before McCarthyism, but Kandel understood even in 28 that arguing for cosmopolitanism could get you in trouble in some quarters, could cause some people to question your loyalty to country. And the third part of the speech says that unless the United States does that, the United States would become a force for violence and for instability in the world. And to connect with an idea that Betty raised in her last set of remarks, I totally agree that this is a conversation that should be global and that should invite people from all quarters, especially because we might actually learn some useful things from people in the South. When I look at the rise of fascism, it is rising in the South as well as in the North. And I would argue that the repercussions of the rise of fascism in a country like the United States of America are potentially more destabilizing to the world than the rise of fascism in Brazil, where it's also rising. Among other things, look at the results of the last two elections in Brazil and in the US, and how well Brazil managed its transition, and how poorly the United States managed the transition, where we still had people in this last election running on platforms of denying the legitimacy of the last election. So I think it's very important to make this dialogue global, especially with a mindset towards learning from other countries. One of the things that I've always found interesting is that when you look at surveys of representative samples of the population around the world, and when people are asked, "Do you know what the Millennium Development Goals are?" In Brazil, the percentage of people who know what the MDGs are is something like 60%. In Indonesia, it's something like 80%. In the United States, it is 5%. So I do think we have a lot of work to do in the North. And certainly, while there is a lot of conflict going on around the world, the big conflicts that we have at the moment, think the war of Russia on Ukraine, I think we would consider Russia a country in the North, are caused by countries in the North more than countries in the South. So that's all to say that I celebrate the fact that you're convening this conversation and you're inviting all of us to look in the mirror and to ask, am I doing everything in my power to be a force for peace at this complicated time? And I guess the test that I use to when I answer that question is, if I'm not feeling a little bit uncomfortable and at risk in what I'm doing, I'm probably not doing everything in my power. If I'm just talking to my students and to people who fundamentally agree with my views, that's not really adding value. Adding value is getting into the places where there is some risk involved in discussing the ideas that we're discussing today.
I agree with you. Thank you, Fernando, for your words. And yes, the idea of ISA is always to work in these two topics that I think they are the core of everything: education for peace and education for sustainability. So thank you very much, and I agree with you. If I don't feel uncomfortable, that's because I need to do more. I don't know if Tony or Betty have some remarks. I have a question from the audience also. Tony, do you want to say something?
I defer to Tony.
Defer to me. Okay, great. I guess I'm thinking about a lot of things right now, but a concept that Fernando brought up, I think it addresses part of the conversation that Betty and I were having that didn't get translated into the webinar today. So your point about the need to democratize the field of peace education is really important. And I think this presents a tremendous challenge, especially as we address and look at the context in which teachers are working. And I guess the context that's most fresh in my mind, and I don't want to talk more about the United States, because this is an international audience, but the context that is most fresh in my mind is this experience I was having in Colombia recently. So, the Ministry of Education brings together this group of educators who are participating in peace education projects in schools and communities and so forth to come and talk about the future of the field. So they're gathered there. And one of the things that sort of the elephants in the room that isn't addressed in that space was the reality that these teachers represent a minority of the teachers in terms of their views about the future of the country of Colombia. Very, very polarized population in Colombia in terms of what they think they need to move forward, what their views are of the truth and reconciliation process, and so forth and so on. And so how do we democratize these processes? The question I want to pose, especially when not everyone's going to be on the same page. What does it look like in the context of how we prepare and engage educators? Because it's one thing for a handful of strong-willed educators who are doing everything they possibly can in the school to be able to countervail the forces of those others who are educating in the opposite direction, right? So what can that look like for us? How do we do it in a way that engages those other educators in these conversations about what the possibilities for peace are? And I don't think we've done enough to look and address that problem. And I think there is another concern that I really have and looking at educators, especially in these kinds of contexts where they're emerging out of war or other violent conflicts, is they are playing a really vital role in facilitating a country and moving towards peace. I think that they're a key bridge. There's sort of this middle out level in society of being able to enact those changes, and a really vital bridge. But that puts them and establishes them as key agents of change. It really politicizes education for them, and puts them in an inherently risky position. And so I guess I'm posing challenges and questions that I want to think about as we explore further what this looks like in reality. This democratizing the field in practice presents obviously these many challenges.
Yes, Betty, you raise your hand.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to both Tony and to Fernando. You both make the point on democratization, which is, I think, essential and a crucial point. And in terms of what Tony just said, how do we educate teachers toward that? I think one of the ways we do that is teaching them the concept and reality of solidarity. And I think that what Fernando points us to, what he talked about, someone mentioning to him that someone could be shot for teaching about global citizenship, that raises the responsibility for all of us to engage in solidarity. I think that also Fernando's question or statement about looking into the mirror and saying to ourselves, have we done enough? Or do we feel, if we don't feel uncomfortable, we're not doing it, and so forth. I think the other question we ask is to look behind us in the mirror. What are others doing? Among the things that others are doing, are there actions that could be in solidarity with my action and strengthen it? What are the ways that I can strengthen others? How do we together become a stronger movement? Also, how do we together begin to develop our own capacities for discernment? Because one of the things that I didn't bring up in terms of making the distinction between international and transnational as arenas for action is we educators in the formal system are always, and as particularly in international education, we're always between a rock and a hard place, because we have to work in those institutions to achieve the goals. And yet the institutions themselves can be an impediment to the goals. So how do we develop our powers of discerning what elements within the institution are conducive and which we can support and nurture, and what elements within the institutions are obstacles, and how do we overcome them in ways that strengthen rather than weaken the core purposes of the institutions, which is to serve the societies and to serve the people, to serve the students that they are educating. So I think, we have so much to learn from each other, and I hope that all of the organizations and the individuals who have been involved in this conversation will pick up something which they can hook up to some other action or movement and give themselves a greater, I'm sorry, it's getting to me. It's a long time for me. Give themselves a more sense of effectiveness and learn more. The most important thing is the learning. And I guess the last thing that I want to say is always remember that we are learners, and we are learners first. And once we think we've learned it, we are no longer good teachers.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Betty, and I think thank you also Tony and Fernando for everything. And I think it's we are lifelong learners as a teachers, and also we learn all the time. But sometimes we have to unlearn in order to learn well, because sometimes we have a lot of learning that we have in the past that was not right, and we have to unlearn and relearn new ways of connecting to people. And I think that the difference and the diversity enriches our debate, because sometimes you do not want to, as Fernando was saying, to speak in an auditorium where everyone thinks like you is easy. The very difficult thing to do is to speak in an auditorium where everyone is against your thoughts, and not to try to convince them, but at least make them reflect, as you were saying, Betty, what are people behind us in our mirror are doing, and how can we benefit or potentiate that, and how can we mark some conducts that are not good to the environment. So I have some questions from the audience. We have 8 more minutes before we go. One question is, how can public school teachers who believe in peace education make education policy change to make it more inclusive? Tony, Fernando, some of you,
I,
you want to
I, I,
share?
I, I do a fair amount of work with governments and policymakers, and I think that there is ample opportunity in policy frameworks already to do to do more peace education. I think the real gap is not in more policy advocacy or more policy change. The real gap is in closing, in execution, in actually translating these ideals. For example, UNESCO monitors the extent to which the spirit of the 1974 declaration is reflected in national curriculum. And yes, there is marginal improvement that could be done, but you look at most countries that have national curricula, there is plenty of room within those curricula to do peace education and so on. What there isn't is a practice that matches those aspirations in either teacher preparation institutions or in programs of professional development for teachers in the classroom. So if I had to prioritize, I would prioritize creating the structures and the programs that actually support teachers so that they know, first of all, that they have a community of peers, so they know they're not alone, and they have the support, both intellectual and of all kinds, so that doing this work is informed by expert knowledge and is also not work done in isolation. And I totally agree with something Betty just said, which is we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can map the institutions that exist. So I will give you an example. As you were talking about collective action, which is how I translated your call for looking behind the mirror at what others are doing and building connections. I serve on the board of directors of an organization in the US called Facing History and Ourselves. They do a lot of human rights education, Holocaust education, and so on. And why reinvent the wheel when there is a wonderful organization that has scale, that has been around for 35 years? What I do in that organization is to say, I want to see on a map where we're working. And what I see on the map is that there are plenty of schools that don't even know that we exist. And I push and I say, why don't we set as a goal that within 10 years, in every school in America, we're going to have at least 3 teachers who would have participated in a program with Facing History, who would be part of that community. Why 3? Because I don't think you can change schools alone. Obviously, you can do something within your classroom, but teachers work in a social context, in an organizational context. And you need to know that someone has your back when you're taking risks. Ideally, it's your school principal, But in some settings in America today, it isn't going to be your principal. So you need to know you have at least 2 colleagues that can form a small community. And that is an achievable goal. So I think this notion that Betty presented, I don't call it looking behind the mirror. I map the landscape and look at who else is out there and figure out a way to connect those dots as opposed to work in your own silo is a way to at least work at scale, which to me is the response to this challenge of democratization. What we should be looking for is ways to work at scale to do what we already know actually works.
Can I respond to the question too a little bit? And I think it fits well with this. A lot of points that have been picked up in our conversation throughout. I think as we as educators kind of approach these challenges of how do we advocate for a more inclusive policy related to peace education, I think there's a tendency to think about policy in purely political terms as a process through which we get what we want, or we acquire power, or we implement a view from up above, right? And I think if we approach like working in local school context with that mindset, we're going to be engaged. That is finding solidarity like we're exploring here, but another is to rethink politics as a process of learning. And I think one of the ways in which we go about creating these and democratizing the field of peace education is working with our school communities of teachers who are like-minded and who see things very differently, and facilitating those spaces of learning amongst and between that community of learners. We need to be able to model those practices amongst and between ourselves. So I think the process needs to be one in which we approach the education of teachers in the same way we would approach the education of our students, engaging in perspective taking, critical thinking, moving the problems into their local reality, and so forth. I don't know if I'm being clear with that, but I think I'm trying to answer the question that I was posing a few minutes ago, what that process could look like. And I think we have just this sort of mindset of politics that I think makes it really difficult for us to engage in that in a meaningful way.
Thank you, Tony. I have another question for Dr. Reimers. As a graduate educator of pre- and in-service teachers in the southeastern US, how do we model balance of doing the uncomfortable / risks with serious ramification? The new extreme right governmental control over what is taught in the classroom, for example, critical race theory, as it is misunderstood.
Can I add something to the first question?
Yes, one second that we will finish with that question, then you can comment the first question.
Okay, fine.
So I have 2 answers, both of which may be insufficient. But one of them is you build alliances. You don't do this work alone. So, for example, if you work in a teacher education institution, there are associations of teacher education institutions that would bring you into contact with people all throughout the nation. In other words, operate at a local and at a national and global level and use those different spheres to enhance, to reinforce one another. And then the other thing is believe in the possibility of everyone to learn, including certainly yourself, but also those who have extreme views that are antithetical to what you have. You may be familiar with the scholarship of Amy Gutmann, former president of University of Pennsylvania and current U.S. ambassador to Germany. But before she did those 2 things, she was a scholar. She was a political philosopher of democratic education. And in her book, I think called Democracy and Education, she argues that it is in the nature of the democratic nature of education that we do need to have those conversations, those negotiations, those contentions, and that it is the resolution of those contentions that becomes the most powerful form of democratic education for our students. I know very well how difficult this process is at the moment in our current context in the US, but I don't see any other way. I will try to put in the link. One of my colleagues Mira Levinson, develops these very good case studies of ethical dilemmas in democratic education. And I was part of a group that discussed one of those case studies, which was exactly about what you're describing, a school board that bans what we would consider democratic education. And I'll see if I can find the link and post it in the chat. But I think you engage. Now, my experience has been that even in the most difficult situations after a civil war, or perhaps more so in those situations, it is possible for people to find common ground. Um, I had the opportunity to facilitate a process after the civil war in El Salvador that was designed to actually help people who had been fighting each other develop a shared view of education for the future. And that was a context in which I felt very unsafe doing what I was doing. And I learned that there is tremendous capacity, even among people who have been killing each other in a battlefield for 12 years, to find common ground for the sake of the children. So don't lose that hope that we can all learn, but you have to create the opportunity for people to hear each other. And I do think that children are their future, are one way we have to help people do that. I'm not saying that any of this is easy. I am fully aware of how difficult it is in the United States of America at the moment.
Thank you, Fernando. I have maybe one or two questions and then we will close. So you were talking about people who already understand this concept, Fernando. So what forms can we do to address those who don't get the need for change and those who are not used to these topics, and how do we engage them? That's the question.
Could you repeat that, Edgardo?
Yes, that Fernando spoke about talking to people who already understand these concepts of education for peace or peace education, but what forums can we go to, or how can we address to those who don't have the need or who don't know about this peaceful education, how we can approach to them, how we can have an auditorium full of people who don't want to know about peace education, how do we engage them? In what ways or what forms can we use?
I can try to respond. I have just placed on the link on the chat a link to the site of an organization called Justice in Schools. And what you see there is a podcast in which we discuss the challenges of getting a school board with very contentious views to agree. So anyway, please share that with those in the meeting. Look, I think one of the principles I've learned as an educator is that it's always easier to meet people where they are, and that the first step in communicating is to listen, is to ask, what are you interested in? So I work with literally thousands of schools with this curricula. And when I approach a school, I don't come to them and tell them, how would you like to teach my curriculum? I tell them, tell me what are you working on? What are you interested in? What current programs do you have of improvement? And then find a way to use that as a bridge, to build a bridge, to help them see the connection between the Sustainable Development Goals and what their priorities are. Frankly, in fact, the methodology that I developed in this book, 60 Lessons, is about that. It's about building a process in a school where you connect the school's priorities and where people are with a more ambitious vision like the SDGs, and you help them see how to go from one to another. So always begin where people are, whether it's children or adults. And the best way to figure that out is to listen.
I'd like to make a comment on that too, in terms of engagement and just the way the question is posed about how. I think we might start. First, I have to say I agree very much with everything that Fernando said about asking the question and the listening as being important. But I think the question might be, why might the others or those we are trying to engage want to engage with us? What would they want to learn or gain from engagement? How might we approach them in such a way as to help them make it that possible while we try to reach our own goals of some sort of constructive communication that is mutually beneficial? I think it's important to have more why questions than how questions.
Thank you, Betty. Sorry, my audio was not working. So for a final question, I have this question that says, many thanks to all speakers for the insights shared during this session. I'm interested in the many capacities that have been noted during this conversation, for example, the capacity for discernment. So what do the speakers feel are the most urgent capacities to develop, and how are these capacities more effectively developed? Tony, Betty, or Fernando?
My answer will be short because we don't have much time. If you look at pages 29 and 31 of this book, there's my answer to your question. 29 and 31.
All right, I'll give a short answer too. L noddings. I think one of the fundamental capacities is the capacity of caring and to care about people, to care about problems, to care about the world, and to find ways to articulate that we as educators care, and that's why we do what we do. That education is an act of caring, I believe.
Thank
Maybe
you very much.
people that don't know these associations, and especially in Latin America, they don't know about these associations, about peace, about a number of things. And it would be great, as you said, I think it was Fernando at the beginning of the first question, that teachers should be trained for peace. Should engage with other people that are doing it, and maybe have a common project among different schools about peace. I think that would be great, and to know more about associations that are doing it. That's my own feeling.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for participating. Thank you, Betty. You're amazing. I hope that at 93 I can be like you, and be there present and having all this will and this knowledge. Thank you, Fernando, for your answers and for your critical thinking. Thank you, Tony, and thank you for being here. Let's hope to meet again soon in another interesting webinar. And I hope that everyone takes something to reflect back home. Thank you very much to all. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Right, thank you.
Peace, everybody.